Hello and welcome to Community Theology Thursday. My name is the Reverend Natasha Beckles. I'm the rector of St. Nicholas Church, Perivale, the home of Community Theology Thursdays, or CTT, where theology is done in community, where global majority God talk has very much moved into the parish and into the neighborhood. And I have to say, friends, community, I'm so excited today. I'm delighted to be joined today by Guilaine Kinouani. How are you, Guilaine?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be with you. Excited to have this conversation. Thank you for having me.
We are so excited to have you. It's such a privilege. Community, I want to let you know that Guilaine is a very special woman in my heart. We've learned so much from her prophetic voice in psychoanalytic theory and just radical thought. And I just wanted to bring her into our community for us to have a conversation. But before we really jump into really introducing Guilaine, where are you located today? Where are you speaking from today?
I am speaking from Buckinghamshire today, which is where
Oh,
home is. Yes, yes.
fabulous, 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 fabulous. So I want to introduce Guilaine properly. I did a little bit more research on her bio, so this is a kind of conglomeration. So Guilaine Kinouani is a psychologist and group analyst. She is the director and founder of Race Relations, which can be found at racereflections.co.uk, which is dedicated to tackling inequality, injustice, and oppression. She previously taught critical psychology and Black studies in London, and her long-standing involvement in anti-racism has deeply influenced her scholarship and thinking. Her award-winning work and writing have been featured in the media. Her first book, Living While Black, her second book, White Minds, are all important books that you absolutely need to get and read. And she's worked so hard to expose the impact of the lived experiences of racism on Black minds and bodies, and really understanding how whiteness has operated through psychologies. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us. And I had already shared with Guilaine the work that we have been doing around Jesus and Recommendation 32. So if you have been here before, you will know that. If you don't know it, have a listen to the previous conversations, because I don't want to waste a moment in terms of walking into this discussion about how Christianity, Jesus becoming white is a key part of the spiritual abuse that has happened to African and African diasporas in terms of their spirituality, what was taken away from us during enslavement, during the colonial period, and this neo-colonial period, which we're very aware of right now. So what I want to begin, we're going to kind of move this into two parts, have a real kind of conversation with Guilaine about her work, her research, and what she brings to this conversation. Yeah. So I'm going to start with a little question about, I know you were doing a PhD and that you have been doing a wide range of studies in your field work. What have you been engaging with? You tell us what you've been doing and why you think you bring to this subject.
So let me start with the academic side of things. I've been studying many things, but I'd said where I spend most of my time is in psychology and in group analysis. Psychology, clinical and counseling psychology, of course, general psychology, and group analysis, which is essentially, to summarize, the intersection of sociology and psychoanalytic thinking in a way that help us understand the difficulties that people might bring to the clinic, but also the kind of dynamics that happen outside of the clinic, right? So social functioning, geopolitical issues, institutional dynamics. those sorts of things. So this is, I would say, more or less my main theoretical terrain, I would say. But I have also spent some time in kind of cultural studies and sociology, and I spent a little bit of time in psychoanalytic thinking, kind of more critical psychoanalytic studies before getting into group analysis. So everything has revolved for me around the question of othering, around the question of what it means to be a Black body in the world. And I find that I have danced for some time. Dancing is very important to me. So I use very much musical analogy and metaphors in my thinking and in my writing. And so I find that I spend a lot of time trying to make sense of my own experience and make sense of my people's experience. And by people, I talk about my family, I talk about my loved one, I talk about my community, and I talk about people of the African diaspora at large. And so wherever I stepped foot in terms of academic field or scholarly pursuit, I try to use that for the benefit of my people in understanding what is it that we can do to better look after ourselves, to dismantle the kind of structure that get in the way of us thriving, and to contribute to our own healing so that we don't essentially become dependent on systems or on structures that are not necessarily designed for us to do the healing work. So those have been, I would say, those have been the question for me that I have been engaged in. I would say that's also important that you haven't put in your introduction, but I often start by the fact that I am French born. I am French inner city born, and that's very important in terms of my introduction to structural inequality and to structural violence, because I was raised in the streets. And sometimes people forget that. And I think that's quite interesting that people forget that about me. I've had some very interesting encounter with professional and with academics. Maybe because I don't fit the mold of what about who they expect me to come from the street. But I like to say that I come from the street because it's one way, firstly, to challenge expectation of what people who come from the ghetto can achieve if given the proper nurture and the proper opportunities and support. But it's also a way to ground the conversation around inequalities, around poverty, but also around the spirit of not only struggle, defiance, transgression, and again thriving, and what is possible by human determination. So it's important for me that I recenter the street often to say that I come from the street. It's important to remember that I come from the street, but also I am of African descent, right? And so I come from the Congo. This is where my ancestry lies, even though I was born in France and I lived all of my life in France, even though actually now I spend so many years in this country. It's probably 50-50 now, approaching 50-50. But I spent my formative years and I was brought up in France and I came in this country. I was already a fully formed adult when I came into England. So I am of Congolese ancestry, and it's becoming incredibly important to my thinking, to my writing, to my conceptualization, the fact that I come from this part of Africa. And maybe we'll come back to that. And finally, I think that is also important that we center that I am a migrant. I am a migrant. I am the children of migrant, and my parents also have histories of mass violence, could say genocide, but also that they are migrants. So, displacement is also quite important to my own history. So you can see that all the problematics that I bring in relation to issues of structural violence, othering, marginalization, racial trauma, traumatization, finding one's place in the world, homelessness. It kind of sits at the core of my own kind of location and positionality.
Thank you so much. That was my next question about location, and you answered it already. Well, we may as well get into, do say more about your ancestry. How has that impacted? What is it about the story of being the daughter of Congolese heritages and story? How has that shaped and formed you? How does that inform your thinking?
I would say it's a complex question, this, because if you had asked me this question maybe 5 years ago, maybe 3, 5 years, certainly before the PhD, I would have said it hasn't really shaped me massively. But then the more I think, the more I've been thinking, and the more that I've been engaged in transgressive and decolonial thinking, the more I realize that I have been shaped in more ways than I think. And a lot of this shaping, a lot of this influence is inherited. I would say possibly genetically, I would say possibly unconsciously, I would say possibly spiritually. So a lot of things are passed down through the generation that we don't necessarily know until we are ready to connect to that knowledge, or that knowledge is ready to connect to us in some ways. So I look at things slightly differently, because when I started writing about ancestral suffering, about issues of intergenerational trauma, the way that I started to frame things conceptually was very much consistent with, Kikongo cosmology and ontologies, and things that I would come up with, which I was very unctuous, because I thought, well, this is very new. This is a very new way of thinking about racial trauma, or this is a very new way of thinking about ethics, or this is a very new way of thinking about morality. And then, a few months later, I would come across, philosophy text about Congolese philosophy. And then I would just find my writing in there. And I thought, oh, shoot. So it's not a new way. It is an ancestral way of thinking about the world. But I was writing in a way that I thought was coming from my own mind, from my own thinking. So it turns out that by my own mechanism of introspection, of looking inward and kind of connecting to the world, I was also kind of connecting to ancestral belief system. So that's one of the questions that I'm interrogating in my thesis. What is kind of passed on through mechanisms that are perhaps less understood, perhaps a bit more spiritual, a bit more metaphysical, that calls into question kind of Western Eurocentric formation of knowledge and understanding what it is to inherit knowledge. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that you live in community, and even though your parents, your relatives, your broader people might not necessarily tell you this is what we believe, or this is how we do things, and this is how we move, you see, you sense, you smell, you taste, right? And so you also inherit things in that way. So, for example, when I traveled to the Congo, and I was the first time I went as an adult last year, exactly, pretty much, day for day, pretty much a year ago. I went dancing because, one of my passion back to music is dancing. And I went dancing and people were telling me, oh my God, it's like you are from Africa, which is very interesting. It's like you are from Africa. So that begs the question. So am I not from Africa? That's a very where do you think I'm from? If it's like I am from Africa, but I'm not from Africa. So it makes you kind of think about the body and what we inherit by way of movement, and how we learn to move in a way that is, again, consistent with the way ancestors moved, and the body and embodiment as a source of knowledge as well.
Fantastic. Rich, 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 because that completely moves across some of the stuff that we have done before in terms of thinking about African cosmology as being the backdrop actually to the Bible, to the Abrahamic stories anyway. You can't understand those stories without having an understanding of certain aspects of cosmology and what you bring around that concept, which in the Western Christian mind has been maligned in so many different ways. But we had other speakers who came and really spoke to us that the early church was better at understanding that, we have people are bringing into their faith all who that they are and what they know already and what their communities have taught them. And you see that again in the way that certain spiritual practices like speaking in tongues comes out in more recently in Pentecostal movement. And that is completely an African perspective and understanding of how to communicate with those who are around us and that presence. And you also we've talked about epigenetics previously as well, and how all of that history is recorded in the body. And I suppose I want to bring to you that, it may not be your research, your experience, your lived experience, your observations as a professional, as a person, about the impact of coloniality and colonial Christianity on the well-being and trauma of racialized communities. Have you got any comment on that? Because you will have seen a lot.
When it comes to the relationship it's a complex relationship, the relationship between Christianity, I would say white Christianity, rather than Christianity at large, and trauma. I think the reality, and you know that more than me, is that white Christianity, was used as a weapon of harm and enslavement and colonialism. So it became an arm to do violence to our ancestors. And so there's always going to be a part of the relationship that is wounding or wounded, at least. If you look at history, because of course the Bible was used to justify enslavement and to justify colonialism for centuries, and of course part of the why we're having the conversation is that the church has come to term with it, at least partly, with its complicity in those atrocities. So there is no denying that. At the same time, and this is where things start to be complex, we have to accept that Christianity has also been a tool of resistance and has allowed people to survive, because without a belief in the afterlife, without the belief that something better was to come, and that there was something much better than what life was like, perhaps people would not have survived. Perhaps we would have lost a lot more people. So it made people in some way, I would say, at group levels, resilient, right? So that's one thing. So you already have the contradiction. It was a tool of harm and atrocity, but at the same time, it allowed people in some way to be resilient to the violence that was done to them. Of course, you could argue, but it also, through that resilience and through the buffering impact that it had, it also served the system. That's true. But it also allowed people to survive. And if people did not survive, maybe some of us would not be here. So this is the core paradox. The other thing is that we have to remember that it was adapted by it. I mean, Christianity, it was adapted, it was made its own by the enslaved population, by the African population. So if you go in the South, in the United States, if you go in, in the Congo, the Christianity that you are going to find there is going to be very different than the Christianity that you are going to find in the middle of, I don't know, the Vatican, because it has also been injected and influenced with local belief system, right? So people have taken, I would say, the religion and make it their own. And the reason why they were able to do that. Now, I'm not an expert on Christianity, but I know a little bit about African belief system. And the reason why I think people were able to do that, contrary to kind of white supremacist belief system, is that they were already in their worldview the belief in a higher power. There was already a belief in a God, and that was why the Christian missionaries were able to import Christianity. So, contrary to a lot of colonial accounts who said, well, people believe in multiple deities, it might well have been true, but even within those belief systems, there was a higher power anyway. There was always a God in most of those spiritual belief systems, and I think that's why things have been married and have become a form of Christianity that is very much Black African, and I would say distinct in some way to white Christianity.
Fantastic. So we have previously talked about different cosmologies. Is there something that you'd be willing to share about Congolese spirituality, what you have learned about that?
Okay, so I can share a little bit. I'm not really an expert, but I can share my understanding. So, in terms of the Congolese believe in a higher power. So there is God. There is a God, and there is a God that is the overseer, the creator of all things. And then below God, you have spirits, or you have the ancestors. Now, not everybody gets to be an ancestor. I think a lot of the time people believe, oh, you die, you're an ancestor, and we praise the ancestor like everybody. That's not how it works. There is a kind of selection of ancestorship. And it is people who serve the community. It is people whose work when they were alive were of note, were of service to the community, that get to be ancestors. And those people, they are just below God. So they stand just below God in terms of that field of communication, or that field of functioning. And then you have other spirits, right? So all the dead and people who have passed away. Now, the difference, as I understand it, between the dead, the normal spirits, and the ancestors, is that the ancestors can influence the action of their, I guess, that's their descendants. That's right. So they have a communication role, and so they are, if you like, the middle person between God and the living being, if you like, as I understand it. But nonetheless, the way that we communicate in this world, on the universe, is a flowing, is a kind of a flowing energy like field, where what we call the dead in the Western kind of cosmology can communicate with the living. So people are never really gone. They stay where they used to be. So those are the fundamental of Congolese, Congo specifically, cosmology.
Oh, how fantastic. Thank you for gifting us. And I suppose that what I want to draw us into, because you work around psychoanalytic theory, you have taught me so much about Frantz Fanon's legacy, and also I've learned so much about group analytic theory from you. And, I wonder what you can bring to the table for us as, our community is going to be diverse, but a good number of them are global majority people who are thinking about, they may be a faith, they may not be, they may be Christian, they may be Muslim, but we're all working within this Abrahamic field, trying to work out how to deal with the fact of how impacted we are by racialized trauma. What do you feel our spirituality, our psychoanalytic theory, Fanon's work, the group analytical stuff, what can that bring to the table for us to all have a seat together?
It's I think fundamentally one core thing that I would take from Fanon's work is the internalization of the oppressor. And so therefore the introjection of white supremacy, and by extension the internalization or the introjection of the of the master. And so the question constantly, and I think it's possibly the most challenging question, it is how or in which way does the master exist within ourselves? In which way are we keeping the master alive within ourselves? And in which way is that affecting our relationship with our people? Right? And in which way is that keeping us complicit in this system of white supremacy? Because we can put a lot of energy trying to fight the system, but actually that energy might be better spent trying to dismantle the system that is within ourselves, right? Because otherwise it's just distraction from the internal work that needs to happen first. That would be an important work that needs to that I would say needs to happen, because my experience is that many people engaged in anti-racism, regardless of their racialization, are very problematic. They are very, very problematic. I'm not even going to go into people who are racialized as white because we're going to take that as a given. But actually, you have people who are racialized as brown who have caused me the most problem actually in this work, more problem than white people. And this is a conversation that we are not prepared to have in terms of how this proximity to the master, how proximity to power and proximity to whiteness can become a bigger problem to liberation and a bigger problem to dismantling racialized inequality than the master itself. Because if you think as white supremacy as a pyramid, there's only what, 5-10% of the whole system that's going to be racialized as white. Everything else is going to be a shade of brown or black, really, if we think about it in terms of number. And so if you have 90% of people who have internalized the 5 or 10 people, the snowy white peak, how are we ever going to dismantle this pyramid? The people at the top don't have to do anything. Actually, they can delegate to the people who are just below them in terms of the stratified system. And I think this is where we are actually, where people in proximal position are causing us more problem. And people at the top of the hierarchy can then say, hey, it's not us, look. And to some degree, it's true and it's not true at the same time. It's true in the sense that it is delegated, and I would say it is delegated often unconsciously, so people can kind of wash out their kind of racist impulse, right? They can disavow that, locate that in other people, that becomes a problem, right? At the same time, it is not true because they are still primarily the beneficiary of that system. And if you are a beneficiary of a system and that system serves you, you have vested interest in that system remaining the same, you're always going to be concerned in the system not changing. right, in things staying the same. So therefore, it is true and it is not true. And I think dynamics of complicity when it comes to proximity to whiteness and to power is something that we need to think a lot more about. I've started to write about that. I talk about it a lot because I do think that this is going to be the battleground over the next 50, 60 years. This is going to be the battleground when it comes to race equality.
This lady is such a prophet on these things, so please take note that she said that 50, 60 years. And what can we be doing about that? What does the work look like?
This is a bigger question. I think we go back to reflective work in relation to the master within. So that is the master within all of us. That includes the master within Black people. That includes the master within brown people who are racialized as brown. But listen, as long as white supremacy remains an aspirational system, we are going to have those dynamics, right? As long as the system of white supremacy can say, hey, you can join the pyramid if you behave a particular way, if you assimilate, or if you do this, that, and the other, you're always going to have people who are not white who are going to aspire to join whiteness and to enter the fortress. And so we are going to have those dynamics. I say one of the things that I've started to think about is non-attachment as a tool, because I think that we live in a system where we have inherited. When I say we, I'm trying to be compassionate, and I'm talking really about people racialized as white and structures of racism really have inherited a lot of sadism, and institutions are quite sadistic. And I don't know why we don't talk sufficiently about sadistic, and particularly sadism towards people who are racialized as Black, towards Black bodies. And I think that once you realize that if you become overly attached to something, that makes you vulnerable within a system of domination. Say, as Black people, we have narcissistic wounds related to recognition because we live in a system where we are constantly put down, where we are rendered inferior, where we are told that we are less intelligent, we are less human, we are less beautiful, we are less everything. And so, whether we like it or not, whether we defend against that or not, whether we battle through that or not, there is a part of us that carries that injury, that insecurity, if we are going to be honest. Now, we can unlearn, we can unpack, but it is not the case that we can unlearn and unpack it as an event. The unlearning and unpack it has to be a process because society is the way that it is. So as the minute you step into society, you put the television on, you open a newspaper, whatever it is, it's going to be the same message that you are going to hear. So therefore, that you are going to that's right, that you're going to ingest, that you are going to have to deal with. So the learning is continuous. And of course, at some time you are going to be more vulnerable than others, and sometimes the message is going to seep through. So the injury, right, or at least the template for that injury, for that wound, for that narcissistic wound exists. So if we carry that wound, guess what supremacy is likely to do, right? To use that to actually either corrupt us. Say, when Black people perhaps are started to unite around a particular cause, they are going to find who is the most vulnerable to recognition, right? And offer some of us the promise of glory, the promise of honors, the promise of this, to dismantle any alliance, to dismantle any solidarity, any unity, any organizing. But if we're able to recognize what is it that fundamentally we desire in our heart, what is it? Is it recognition? Is it success, material success? Is it, I don't know, fame? Whatever because we are human beings. We are going to have those human needs. We are going to have those material, those flesh. We are, human from a Christian perspective. We are going to have those sinful needs and wants and wish. It's what makes us human. Once we recognize that, our own vulnerability,
Yeah.
Our work is to detach from that, is to know that, okay, I have a vulnerability to fame. I can be easily corrupted. My heart can be corrupted in terms of fame or recognition. So I need to learn to detach from that, to be less vulnerable, first of all, for me. So I cannot be used statistically by people within white supremacy, but also I am less corruptible for my people. So that when we organize, actually, if there's going to be less of us that can be tempted to work for the system of white supremacy. And if we do that as a group and we support each other towards this idea of detachment, I think that we stand more of a chance that we can work to dismantle white supremacy. And whether that's white people, whether that's Black people, whether that's brown people, I think we all have to work towards detachment. But I think that those who are more racially vulnerable and carry systemic vulnerabilities because of those inferiority messages that we have internalized over centuries are more at risk. So that would be something that I suggest that we can do.
Fire. That's all I can say, because we're in the middle of Lent. And for anybody who knows, the way you spoke just then reminded me of Peter having his conversation with Jesus and him saying, you know, you're being sifted. And the role that what we describe as the enemy has in just finding whatever it is to strum to draw you away. We're in Lent, and I think of Jesus going into the wilderness and the conversations he has with that same devil about his identity, about his ability to meet his own needs, about his calling to leadership and finding ways of getting there, but by using effectively whiteness. And I love the way that, without even thinking of it, I look at whiteness as our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's the principalities and powers of the mind. And that how these systems you've just described enter into the mind and work within us and through us and take us off what our actual calling is. And you just reaffirm how demonic it is, how diabolical it is that this caste system, this global caste system, in just 400 years is manifesting so much. And I think there's many things. It's not for me to be completely disappointed with the church, but you know, you have to love it, and in loving it, you have to be able to critique it. That's what love is.
Yeah.
That we, on the very inception of the early church, there's conversations about race. Whether you're talking about the first martyr, Stephen, getting killed, he is given the job of looking after the Hebrew women and the Greek women, and the arguments that are going on between that, and how whether it's xenophobia, and in our time, this modern understanding of how race doesn't exist until you get to 60, 61, and you know, all of these times when people have already got to this point that it becomes a legal space. But you bring to the fore how much all of it we are given in our scriptures quite strong support as to how to address it, how to understand it. And the failing of the church is it's never been properly used. You know, it's never been properly understood what it means, the imago Dei, made in the image of God, what it means, how the enemy will scratch your spot that you've picked up in your family, that you've picked up in your community, that whatever message that the community is giving back to you. And you're not able, there's another writer, Cole Arthur Riley, who talks about us not being able to see our own faces. We need other people. And this is why I'm so fascinated with what group analysis, because you just, you know, from psychoanalytic theory have just explained so much about the spirituality is trying to teach us, but you clarify it. That's why you're so prophetic. You clarify it and you can see the light of it. But I want to bring into it what you know about group and analytic thinking. And I know that you don't just put that down to Fuchs and his kind of an analysis of that. That's been part of who we are as people. I think of the kind of philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is in that relational connection that we find ourselves, that we see our faces, that we are both wounded and healed. And I just want you to bring to bear what group analytic thinking can bring to this discussion on how we deal with this racialized trauma, this spiritual trauma that we are struggling with.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be useful in terms of group thinking, in terms of group analytic theory. Chiefly the idea that the separation that we tend to make between the individual and the group, and we could extend that in terms of the psyche and the structured institution, and we could go further in terms of society and people are just illusion. We could go even further and we think a lot of binary, what I say a kind of Euro modern binary formation around separatism, around individualism, are misconceived. And actually, they don't help us to understand the human condition. They certainly don't help us to understand the experience of being in the world as Black and the experience of racial trauma. So, for example, we know that for people who are experiencing racial traumatization, and I don't see racial traumatization as a pathology that can be healed. It's the world that needs to be healed, not the individual. As long as the world is pathological, I'm afraid we're going to resist in some way, and part of the way that we're going to resist is sometimes our body, our mind is going to be disrupted. If we were not disrupted, disturbed by a pathology in the world, then there would be something fundamentally inhuman about us, because you are not configured to thrive within dysfunctional environment unless you are also a dysfunctional organization. So what I want to say is this, that we know when people experience racial trauma in the, say, call it in the here and now, as we speak in therapy, they get activated, they get wounded, but that wound that get open in the present often carries echoes of what has happened to their peers, to their parents, to their ancestors. So it's not unusual for people to feel distraught. Say, for example, you go to work and then your boss says something that is out of line and that you pick up as being discriminatory. And I trust people's experience, because as human beings, we are very good at reading intention. We are good. On balance, we are going to be correct. So if you read something as being discriminatory, the chances are it was discriminatory. And so that might make you distraught. But it's going to be some time, 8 times out of 10, you are going to be okay. Because imagine if Black people were distraught each time they hear something discriminatory, we would never get out of bed. So 8 times out of 10, we are going to brush it off. But there's going to be this 2 times out of 10 where we're not going to be able to brush it off, because we are, again, human beings, because sometimes we are going to be vulnerable, because sometimes there's going to be too much going on, because sometimes we're not going to have the support, because we're going to be too stressed, whatever. For a variety of reasons, 2 times out of 10, we're not going to be able to brush it off. The trouble is that if you have this experience 10 times a week, or if you have this experience 10 times a month, it's a lot of 20% to have to actually contend with, that affect you. And when those experiences affect you, well, what comes into your mind is not only what is happening in your moment. So you go back to the other times in your life when you might have been treated unfairly. And then you go back to the time that perhaps your parents might have been treated unfairly. And then you go back to enslavement and slavery. And so then you carry the hurt and the wounding, right? So your mind almost kind of time travels. And so you carry the wounding of generation. So it's not only what is happening in the here and now that is actually impacting your experience of suffering. You're also carrying the suffering of generation that have been wounded, particularly because those generations have never obtained justice and repaired. So their wounds remained completely unaddressed and unhealed. So that's one way to think about racial trauma, and kind of group analytic invite us to think about what is the past, what is the present, and the distinction that we make are they really, really necessary? Are they really useful? But another way to think about group analytic is when we think about, the beef between the psychologist and the sociologist, when it comes to thinking about racism, and the psychologists tend to think, well, it's attitude and it's authoritarian personality and blah, 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 character flows of some kind, bias that leads to race inequality. And the sociologists say, well, no, it's the structure and institutional racism, and you can have racism without racist. This kind of thinking, the more institutional kind of racism argument. Well, the group analyst might say, well, the more radical group analyst might say, well, the distinction that you're making between the individual and the structure is really a waste of time, because the structure and the individual are one of the same. They're just extension of the same field of communication. So once we understand that, we know that if we work and we focus our attention at one level with quotation mark, it's necessarily going to impact the other, right? So there is no point arguing that the institution is racist, but the people inside that institution is not racist. It makes zero sense. Because if the institution is racist, and we know that the institution and the people are one and the same, necessarily people are going to carry some racism. The same way that if those people are racist, the institution are going to be racist. One and the same. Let us get on with trying to tackle racism rather than having this unnecessary conversation that divide field of communication and functioning, and actually distract us from tackling the real issue, which is white supremacist violence.
Just you saying the word distraction again brought me back from what you were saying earlier about how all of this is a distraction. It reminded me of Toni Morrison making that point. But your explanation of racial trauma, it also brings up the question of time, because you just started to touch on it. And there's a cosmology behind that you know about. What is, in the Western world, the understanding of time is so, and actually both biblically and in this frame that you're describing is revealing a different understanding of time. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, without getting very technical, because first of all, it's not my area of expertise, but I think a little bit about the temporal, because if we're thinking about the clinic and we're thinking about trauma, we have to think about the temporal, simply because people who experience racial trauma are what we say triggered. People who experience trauma are triggered. What does it mean to be triggered? Triggered means to be taken back to an event that was painful. So when you are exposed to a stimuli in your present time, in your present environment, it takes you to a prior encounter, right? And so you experience the here and now as you felt, so affectively or cognitively or relationally, in the there and then. So there is a confusion temporally. So the past and the present becomes blurry. Now, of course, if we speak in that way, we are still upholding this distinction between the past and the present. But if we think about that, if we can more or less time travel, if experience of racial injustice at large, can cause us affectively, right, cognitively, relationally, to time travel, and for boundaries, temporal boundaries, to become blurry, then there is a case to say that actually is time really linear, right? And so this is the dominant formation within the West. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't people who have challenged that. There are philosophers, plenty of philosophers that have challenged this notion. even within the West. But generally, particularly in our everyday kind of discourses, the dominant frame is that we go from past, present, future, and that times run in a line, right, from past to future. But we know that that's not our lived experience, right? As people of color, it's not our experience when you are traumatized, that it can feel as though you cannot move through
Mhm.
wounding experience. And certainly when we think about racial injustice, despite the discourses of the post race, the post trauma, there is that feeling of stuckness that Fanon is well known for writing about, where the colonial object is not allowed to move. Temporal delineation is relegated to the past. So we know that there's something very important to think about in relation to how we think about time. And it is useful to go into African ontologies or cosmology to think about how other people in the world tend to think about time as being, for example, more cyclical
Mhm.
than temporal.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. And you mentioned Fanon. How does Fanon help us? His legacy. What should we be reading of Fanon to help us unpick
Oh,
this?
it's only written 4 books, so you can read all of them if you're really into I'm a psychologist. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm someone who think a lot about the clinic. So for me, my cortex is of course black skin, white mask. But if you are really into decolonization, read The Race of the Earth. I would recommend the Race of the Earth, or Towards the Dying Colonialism. But read anything of Fanon. Read anything of Fanon. He's not the most accessible writer, I would say, but I would say that part of it is because it's translated from French, and so a lot of the translated texts they become even more opaque when they are
Mm.
translated. So if you read French, read them in French if you can. If not, take your time. Read what you can. Just try to understand what you can understand, bearing in mind that you're not going to understand everything. Even I pick up Fanon and I read things, and there are things that I don't understand. But then I read them again, and then I think, oh, I understand things a bit better. And then I read them again. Oh, I see that thing I didn't see the first time. And I think
Mm.
that's the reality. As someone that is highly complex in his writing, you have to remember is a philosopher. Philosophy is not exactly the easier thing to read. So you have to bear in mind, and you have to tolerate that you're not going to understand everything, but you are going to understand some things.
What has Fanon gifted you?
Who Fanon has gifted me a lot. Primarily, everything that I do in relation to racial trauma and racial justice is Fanonian. Uh, you know, the maybe the impetus to be political in the world, right? And that sense of having a mission, that each and every one of us, he would say each generation has a mission and must discover their mission in relation to what they were put on earth to do in the world, right? In relation to justice, in relation to liberation, and not to take things for granted. That we have work to do, and it is on us to do this work. And someone that is as principled, that was as principled, and has committed and willing to actually walk the talk. Highly inspirational. So inspiration in relation to mission. Someone that was engaged in liberation, obviously in relation to the colonial wars and Algeria in particular, but more importantly, I think there's something very inspiring in being committed personally and professionally to the cause, right? To the cause of liberation.
Amazing, 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 amazing. So you've given us some recommendations on what to read. Are there any others that you would signpost us to, and you can choose some of your own books too?
Well, no, I mean, read what makes your heart sing. I tend to work a lot with intuition these days, which is also more Afrocentric than
Sorry, I
Eurocentric.
missed it. What was that you said?
Intuition.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the ideas and things that I have discovered and books that I've picked up, I think that they came my way because they needed to find me at a particular point in time. And so, read what you need to read. And I'm convinced that you will find what you need to find, or what you need to find will find you in the at the right time. So one thing that I would say, I had a lecturer, well, not a lecturer, personal tutor some time ago. I think when I was writing my dissertation, when I was doing my cryptanalytic studies, and he said to me, "Listen, don't force it. If you try to read a text more than 3 times and it's not working, put it aside, read something else." Because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the time, I find that, I mean, there could be a number of reasons why you can't access a text, but the reality is that there's a lot of people that might say things in a way that you can access. And I think that if reading becomes so laborious, then it puts you off engaging with ideas, and it puts you off engaging with theory and understanding the world. That defeats the purpose. So give it 2, 3 times, try. And if it's not according to you, read something else. A lot of the time, what I would say is that when it comes to the big authors and the big thinkers, like, I don't know, Freud, Fanon, Foucault, Melanie Klein, whatever, the big people, you read people on people. So you might read someone that has written on Freud because you are so scared to access Freud directly, because you think, oh, it's too big and I'm never going to understand anything. And actually, just go to Freud directly, because he's a lot more accessible than reading someone on Freud. And you'll find
Mm-hmm.
that with Fanon, and you'll find that with a lot of people trying to overcomplicate what the guy is saying or what the woman is saying in the first place. So I would say, if you can, go to the source first and see how you get on, because 8 times out of 10, what I found is that they are more accessible than if you read someone on Freud, Fanon, Melanie, whatever. I find that when you read the people on the people, they're the one who make things more complicated. I don't know what is the agenda. So go to the writers and the thinkers themselves. And if you struggle, then go to the people who have assimilated. But bear in mind that it will be their reading, it will be their take. Because a lot of the time when I read them, I don't even agree with other people's understanding. So you may reach a different understanding of the thinker, of the words, and that's okay. I mean, that's the beauty of it.
Amen. Amen. I'm just thinking, we're going to draw this conversation to a close shortly, but there might be somebody who's thinking, what practically should I be doing tomorrow to protect myself better from racialized trauma, to prepare myself as I walk into my majority white church? What can I be doing to strengthen myself, protect myself as I'm walking into my majority Black church?
Okay.
What can I be doing to keep myself safe and well and watering that well for myself?
Okay. So I would say 3 things. Hopefully, I will remember all 3. Number one is, you must look after yourself in the best way that you can. And looking after yourself means looking after yourself physically, be in the best shape that you can physically, mentally, and spiritually. Because you have to remember, the weaker we are, the easier it is for us to be weakened
Mhm.
by other forces, right? That include white supremacy, any enemy of some kind will attack you when you are weaker. That's just war tactics, I'm afraid. Your enemy
Mhm.
is not going to wait when you are in the strongest position possible to come for you, right? In my own experience, looking at when I've had serious difficulty with white supremacy and serious violence, it was always when there was something going on in my life.
Mhm.
Always, either because I was bereaved, there was something, and that's when people can boom. It's not
Mhm.
a coincidence. This is a war tactics. So you have to make
Mhm.
sure that you keep yourself in the best shape possible, right? Psychologically. So do things that bring joy to your
Amen.
heart, right? Whether it's music, whether it's being with your people, whether it's writing, you need to ask yourself, what is it that brings you joy? Number one, fundamentally, make sure that you are connected to, I'm Christian, so I would say connect to God, of course, but if you're not Christian, connect to a greater power, to a sense of purpose. If you don't have this connection, it makes it very difficult to have a sense of why you are here on this earth to do. But you need to have a sense of purpose of some kind. I'm not saying everybody should be a believer. Don't have to be a believer. But having the sense of purpose is definitely going to help you, right? And number three, in terms of your resilience, in terms of your fortitude, I rather use fortitude, is to look after your body. People who are racialized as Black and brown, we are at increased risk for a number of chronic health issues that include cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure. And that can be prevented by a healthy lifestyle. So remember to do what you can to lead a healthy lifestyle. You might think, yeah, that's kind of cliche advice, but everything is connected. If you look after your body, your mind's going to be stronger. You look after your mind, your body's going to be stronger, because the two are, of course, one and the same, or at least interconnected. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you can, be of service to your community in one way, shape, or form. How you do that, I'm going to leave that to you. There's various ways to be of service, but we do know that people who feel that they are of service to their community, whether it's helping people to overcome, to struggle, whether it's volunteering, whether it's organizing, if you're of service, that is going to help and your own fortitude, but that's also going to contribute to the struggle. So think about what you can do to organize. That is going to be helpful. Number three, and that's related to being of service, don't forget the children, the little one. Those are the generation that's going to come after us. They watch us. So if we're not looking after ourselves, they won't be looking after themselves. So we are going to repeat the same cycle of neglect, which is also a consequence of racial trauma. But more importantly, if we want better, we need to actually model better. And we have to remember that children also experience racial trauma and racial violence. So we need to make ourselves available for them, and we need to create safe space for them to be able to come to us and confide in us and seek our support when they are targeted. Because I tell you, my own children from 4 or 5, it started, the monkey comment started. And if your children are not reporting that to you, more than likely, it's not that it's not happening to them. It's just that more than likely, if it's just, they're just not telling you.
Yeah. You're such a gift to us as a community. I want to thank you for this conversation. Honestly, I have more questions. We could have gone into gender. We could have gone into so many different things. You're going to have to come back. I absolutely going to have you come and speak to us as a community at Community Theology, because you have so many gifts to give, and it's great to have that time with you. So
I'm glad. Thank you very much. It was an honor. I'm glad that it was useful. I hope it is useful for the community at large. We have to, we have to be of service. We have to help one another. There's no other way.
No other way. There's no other way. Well, dear friends, I hope you found that a rich conversation. I want to express my great thanks to our guest, Guilaine. She is a gift. But I don't want to dehumanize her. She's also this person who has sat and thought and done this work and walked a particular journey, and it's not an easy journey. So as we come to the end of this episode, this conversation, I just want to signpost you back to St. Nicholas Church, St. Nicholas Church, Paravel.church. If you want to keep up with all that's happening here, I absolutely am going to get Guilaine to come and speak to us in this place. So you'll have to keep up with that if you do want to come and hear her speak and speak into this topic. But I'm so grateful to you as the listeners who have kept us together and supported and interested. And, I'd love to hear your feedback on it. Going forward, we are going to continue with Community Theology Thursday. We'll be picking up on a different theme in the autumn term, and I'll let you know more about that. But if you would like to sponsor a future Community Theology Thursday event or series, I'd be grateful if you could email me at rector@stnicholasperavel.church. Until next time, thank you, Guilaine. Thank you, everyone, and we will meet soon.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everyone.
God bless.